Hi, and welcome to the segment on stewing. So earlier on we fabricated the top round, we cut it down into a pot roast, and then we also cubed up some of the remaining pieces into cubes, and today we're going to use that for the stewing method. How the stewing method differs from the braising method, the steps themselves are basically identical, but typically, not always, but typically stewing is cut up pieces of meat, cut up chicken, lamb, so on and so forth, today beef, and it's fully submerged in the cooking process. So you've been introduced to the first combination cooking method of braising, and in braising we heated the pan, which I'm getting ready to do right now. I've got it on low, I'm kicking up on a higher temperature now. Heating the pan. Once the pan gets hot, we're going to add the oil. We'll heat the oil, and then we're going to add the seasoned meat. Brown the meat, because again we're going to make a brown stew today. We could make a white beef stew, which means we would cook it doing the stewing method without the browning component of it. And then we're going to remove the meat to glaze the pan. Add the meat back in. Once we add the meat back in, we're going to add the aromatics and the vegetables in this. Make sure it's fully covered with the stock, and then we're going to cook it low and slow. The time will be a little bit faster when we stew because again you're dealing with smaller cut up pieces of meat, where when we braise, depending on the thickness of the meat, something that's this thick is going to cook a lot faster than something that's this thick. So let's get started. I have the pan heating. It's pretty good and hot right now. I'm going to add the oil. I have about 1.5 tablespoons of oil, and I'm getting a pretty nice quick swirl there. I'm going to let that heat just a moment, or a little bit higher. I want it really good and hot because when I put that stew meat in there, it's going to release liquid pretty quickly, and I don't want it steaming in its own juices. I want it browning up fairly quickly. So while that's heating up, I'm going to take the stew meat and season it up a little bit. Some chefs at this point will coat it in flour. So in essence, when they sear it in oil, they're making a little bit of a roux. This particular one, we're going to thicken up with a little bit of a cornstarch slurry, so we're not going to make the roux. And both are good. The roux has a slightly better taste, and I like the clarity that the cornstarch is going to give my stew when I cook it and thicken it with the sauce. Okay, so here we go. Everything's seasoned up. Pan's really good and hot, and that's what you want to hear. You want to hear that sizzle as soon as the meat goes in. I'm just going to kind of flatten it out so all the pieces of meat are on the hot surface of the oil. You don't want to stir it around at this point. At that point, you're just kind of shredding up the meat. You want to let it sit there for a few moments to get a nice brown color. This is the patience factor. And if you're not sure of something, you can always peek a little bit. Every single side's not going to get fully brown, but the more brown you have, the more caramelization is occurring, the more Maillard reaction is happening, and it's going to change the flavor. It's going to give it a little bit more depth, a little bit more deeper flavor, and certainly deeper color. I'm just going to give it a quick little stir, or get lightly brown. Flatten it back out. It's not going to brown if a piece of meat is sitting on top of another piece of meat. And we'll come back in just a moment once it's all nice and browned all the way around and continue on in the process.